Get comfortable and let your breathing slow. There's nothing left to do tonight but rest. Let the day fade as we settle into the soft, still wisdom of the empty cup. If this brings you rest, subscribe, and there'll be a new one waiting tomorrow night. Nan lifts the teapot with both hands. It is a small motion, careful and unhurried, the kind of gesture made 10,000 times until it no longer requires thought. The sound that follows is familiar, the low pour of hot liquid into ceramic, a sound that belongs to early morning and to the particular quiet that settles between two people who have not yet begun to speak. The professor sits across from him. He is comfortable in his chair. He has made this kind of visit before to teachers and scholars, and the visits have always confirmed what he already suspected, that he is a man who knows a great deal, who has read widely, who has thought carefully, and who comes to these encounters already furnished with the vocabulary required to understand whatever he is about to be told. The tea fills the cup, it reaches the rim, and the professor's hands rest open on his knees, and the pour continues. The liquid crosses the edge in a slow, deliberate thread. It spreads across the lacquered surface of the table, finding the low places, following its own logic. The professor watches it. Something in him does not yet understand what he is seeing, or rather, some part of him understands, and another part is still arranging the observation into the shape of a mistake, an accident, an awkward moment in an otherwise ordinary afternoon. He says something. He says that the cup is full, that no more will go in. His voice is polite. It carries the faint surprise of someone who has noticed a social error and is correcting it gently, the way one corrects a host who has served a guest something they cannot eat, with tact and without reproach. Nan sets the teapot down. He looks at the professor across the spreading pool of tea. He says, in words that have traveled through telling and retelling across more than a century, that the professor is like this cup, so full of his own opinions and speculations that there is no room to receive anything new. He says that in order to receive, the cup must first be empty. Then the visit is over, and the professor stands, and the afternoon light in the room has not changed, and the tea continues to cool on the table, and something has shifted very slightly in the way the afternoon feels, though the professor may not yet be able to say exactly what. This is the parable as it has come down, set in Meiji-era Japan, in the late 19th or early 20th century, at the home of Nanin, a Zen master of the Rinzai school. The professor is sometimes described as a scholar, sometimes as a university man, a person of learning who has traveled to inquire about Zen. The details vary a little in the telling, as the details of all parables vary. The way the shape of a pebble changes slightly depending on which hand holds it, while the essential weight remains the same. What does not change across the tellings is the central gesture, the tea poured past the brim, the silence before the spill, the master's reply. What does not change is the cup. The story arrived in Western reading rooms through the work of D.T. Suzuki, the scholar who spent decades translating Buddhist philosophy, and particularly the specific, difficult, compressed form of it that had developed in Japan, into English. His essays in Zen Buddhism, published in volumes across the late 1920s and early 1930s, carried the Nanin story out of Japanese Rinzai culture and into a Western readership already primed by decades of Romanticism and by the pragmatist tradition to value direct experience over inherited doctrine, individual encounter over institutional authority, the moment of genuine perception over the accumulated weight of what one has been told. The parable was, in a certain sense, perfectly timed. It arrived when its particular lesson was exactly what a certain kind of Western reader was most prepared to hear and least prepared to understand, which is, perhaps, as good a condition as any for the beginning of actual learning. Suzuki himself was a complicated and careful figure, a man who worked across 2 languages and 2 philosophical cultures with a patience that is visible in the texture of his prose. He sat at his desk surrounded by manuscripts and letters, moving between Japanese and English in the particular cognitive space that belongs to translators, that interior country where meaning and its expression are always slightly apart, always requiring one more act of attention to bring closer together. He knew that translation is never merely a technical operation, that it is always also interpretation, that what arrives in a new language is never exactly what departed from the old one, and that this loss is also sometimes a gain, that the parable heard for the first time in a foreign language can land with a freshness that familiarity has gently worn away. He included the Nanin story, not, one senses, because it was the most philosophically sophisticated thing he could offer, but because it was the most honest point of entry, a story so simple it could not be misunderstood in its surface meaning, and so dense in what lay beneath that surface that a student could spend years returning to it without exhausting it. What the story encodes, beneath its surface simplicity, is a teaching that the Zen tradition holds with great care and great persistence. It is the teaching that certainty is a more dangerous obstacle to wisdom than ignorance. Ignorance knows it does not know. Ignorance is, in a certain structural sense, already the empty cup, uncomfortable perhaps, and eager to be filled, but open. The professor in Nanin's parable is not ignorant. He has read the texts. He knows the vocabulary. He can discuss the concepts with facility and precision, can situate ideas in their historical context, can trace the lineage of a doctrine and identify where it diverges from related doctrines. He is exactly the kind of person who would visit a Zen master and feel confident in the encounter, and this confidence, not his learning, not his intelligence, not his academic standing, but his confidence, is precisely what prevents him from receiving anything Nanin might actually offer. The cup that is already full cannot be filled further. This is not a paradox. It is not a trick. It is simply the nature of containers. But the teaching is more specific than the simple image suggests, and it is worth staying with it long enough to feel where the specificity lies. The Zen tradition distinguishes, with some care, between 2 modes of knowing. One is discursive, the kind of knowing that moves through language and logic and conceptual categories, the kind that the professor has in abundance, the kind that allows him to read a text, compare it with other texts, understand what it is asserting, and evaluate whether the assertion is well supported. This mode of knowing is not useless. It is genuinely useful. It navigates the ordinary world with considerable effectiveness, and the tradition does not dismiss it. But it is a knowing that operates on the surface of things, a knowing that handles representations of experience rather than experience itself, a knowing that is always one step removed from the thing it is describing, the way a map is always one step removed from the territory, however accurate it may be. The other mode is something the Sanskrit tradition calls prajna, a word that does not translate cleanly into English, partly because English does not have a category ready for what it names. It is something like direct insight, non-dual awareness, the kind of knowing that does not hold its object at arm's length and examine it, but in some sense coincides with it, becomes continuous with it, the way water in a vessel takes the shape of the vessel without a gap between them. This is the kind of knowing the Zen tradition is ultimately concerned with. not as a feeling or a sensation, not as a mystical experience to be cataloged and reported, but as the fundamental mode of awareness that exists. So the tradition holds prior to the division between the knower and the known, prior to the interior commentary that says what everything is and means. The professor has a great deal of the first kind of knowing and has not yet encountered the second, partly because the first kind has so thoroughly and comfortably occupied all available interior space. The empty cup is not, in the Zen teaching, an absence. It is not a vacancy or a lack. The tradition is careful about this. The emptiness it gestures toward is not the emptiness of a vessel waiting passively to be of use, not the blankness of a page before writing, not the absence that makes presence possible in a merely logical sense. It is something the tradition treats as an active and functional quality, receptive spaciousness, a kind of openness that is itself a presence, the way silence is not the absence of sound, but a quality in its own right, something one can feel and inhabit, something with texture and temperature. The Japanese and Chinese Zen traditions have many terms that approach this quality from different angles, the way cartographers approach an unmarked territory from multiple directions, each map showing something true that the others leave in shadow. This quality of openness, the tradition suggests, is not something that must be created from nothing. It is not manufactured by effort or installed through technique. It is in a certain sense already present, present before the cup was filled, present beneath the filling, present as the very capacity for experience that learning and certainty and accumulated opinion have gradually and unknowingly covered over. Nanin is not telling the professor to become empty. He is pointing out with the simplest possible gesture that the professor is already somewhere beneath everything he has brought with him to this meeting, a cup, that the cup's original nature is openness, and that what has filled it can, in the appropriate conditions, be allowed to drain. The Rinzai school, to which Nanin belongs, uses a particular pedagogical instrument called the koan, a compressed, often paradoxical statement or question, assigned by a teacher to a student, and used not as a puzzle to be solved by ingenuity, but as a kind of sustained encounter with the limits of discursive thought. The most famous of these, Joshu's Mu, the question of what a student asked about whether a dog has Buddha nature, and the master's reply of Mu, a word that means something like no or nothing, is not a question that rewards analytical effort. Effort is, in fact, precisely what will not work. The student who approaches it cleverly, who marshals arguments and constructs logical responses, and arrives at the next meeting with the teacher carrying a well-reasoned answer, will find the answer rejected, not because it is wrong by the standards of ordinary logic, but because what the koan is measuring is something other than logical competence. The teacher's face across from a student who has answered a koan gives nothing away. This, too, is instruction. The silence that follows a response contains more pedagogical weight than any verbal reply could carry, because the silence is asking the student to feel, directly, without the mediation of the teacher's approval or disapproval, whether the response arose from genuine encounter with the question or from the more comfortable territory of accumulated learning. The student who has approached the koan from within the full cup, bringing everything they know to bear on a question that is specifically designed to be unreachable by that route, will eventually reach the place where everything they know has been tried and found insufficient. And what lies on the other side of that exhaustion is what the koan was designed to make possible. The koan is not a question, it is an instrument for emptying. The professor walking home through the evening streets of Meiji, Japan, carries something with him that he did not carry on the way there. It is not quite knowledge, it is not yet understanding, it is something quieter than either, A small disturbance in the surface of his certainty, a hairline crack in the smooth cup of what he thought he already knew, barely visible, and if he is not careful, easily sealed back over by the resumption of ordinary thought. He walks past lanterns and through the smell of evening meals being prepared, past people moving in the particular unhurried way of those who know exactly where they are going, and his own footsteps sound slightly strange to him, the way a familiar word sounds strange when repeated long enough. Something has shifted very slightly in the quality of his attention, though if someone asked him now what he had learned at Nanin's house, he would not be certain what to say. This quality of not quite knowing, of having encountered something that cannot be placed into the existing filing system of the mind, is part of what the parable is designed to produce. It is not discomfort for its own sake. The tradition is not interested in making students uncomfortable as a goal in itself. But the discomfort of the overfull cup, the mild vertigo of not being able to receive something that is clearly being offered, is the first honest signal that the cup is full, and without that signal, there is no motivation to examine what has been filling it. The professor needed to see the tea spread across the lacquered table. He needed to see, with his own eyes, the external image of what was happening inside his own mind during every encounter with a new idea, that the new idea arrived, found no room, and spilled unused across the table while he mistook the spill for a learning. Suzuki, translating this story at his desk in the early 20th century, understood something about the moment he was working in. The Western readers he was writing for had inherited a philosophical tradition that placed enormous value on what the Zen teaching would call the full cup, on the accumulation of systematic knowledge, on building argument upon argument toward increasingly comprehensive and coherent structures, on the expert who knows most within a given domain and whose confidence is, within that domain, epistemically appropriate. This tradition had produced extraordinary things. It had mapped the physical world with precision. It had built institutions of learning that preserved and extended knowledge across generations. It had developed logical tools of extraordinary power, and it had, in doing all of this, created a culture of the expert, a culture in which the fully furnished mind was the ideal and the admission of not knowing was routinely experienced as failure rather than as the beginning of something. Into this culture, Suzuki brought a simple story about a teapot. He did not argue against the value of systematic knowledge. He did not suggest that the Western philosophical tradition was wrong. He offered instead a parable, the lightest and most patient form of philosophical instruction, the form that asks nothing of the listener except a willingness to receive the image and let it rest in the mind, asking whatever questions it asks in its own time and at its own depth. The parable works when it works not by persuading, but by pointing. It points at something the reader or listener already knows, something they have felt in their own experience, the sensation of coming to a conversation, so prepared to have a certain kind of exchange that any exchange of a different kind simply cannot find purchase, the sensation of listening to someone speak while internally composing the response, the sensation of reading a difficult text and finding that it confirms at every turn what one already thought, without quite registering the places where it does something else entirely. The professor recognizes himself in Nanin's parable, not because Nanin has described him accurately, but because the overfull cup is a recognizable interior experience, an experience almost everyone has had and almost no one has examined. The Zen tradition in which Nanin taught had, by the time of this meeting, been developing for over a millennium. It had traveled from the Indian subcontinent through China, where it had taken on the particular qualities of Chinese thought, the Taoist comfort with paradox, the Confucian attention to the quality of relationship between teacher and student, and had then crossed to Japan, where it had developed yet again, absorbing and transforming the aesthetic sensibility it found there. The preference for the spare and the asymmetrical, the willingness to let an unfinished line do more work than a completed one, the garden that leaves empty space not as a failure to fill, but as the primary element of the composition. By the time Nanan poured tea for the professor, the empty cup teaching had behind it centuries of careful development, not as a doctrine written down and argued over, but as a living practice, demonstrated again and again in the space between teacher and student, in the moment of the koan encounter, in the walking meditation where the meditator pauses mid-step, not because something has gone wrong, but because the habitual interior commentary has for a single unlooked-for moment fallen quiet, and the courtyard is simply the courtyard, present and full of its own silence, requiring nothing from the person standing in it. A student in such a moment is not having a thought about the courtyard. They are not categorizing its elements or comparing it to other courtyards they have known, or composing a description of it that they will carry away and use later. They are simply in it, the way the tea is simply in the cup, before anyone has asked whether the cup is the right shape, or the tea is the right temperature, or the moment is the right moment for a philosophical insight. The courtyard does not require the student's interpretation to be a courtyard. The courtyard is entirely sufficient. This is the particular quality of experience the Zen tradition is pointing at, and the pointing is notoriously difficult, because the pointing is done with language, and language is precisely the medium that carries the perceiver one step away from direct encounter with what is being pointed at. Every description of the empty cup experience fills the cup a little. Every explanation of what beginner's mind feels like is in some degree a demonstration of the mind that is already beyond beginning. The tradition is aware of this difficulty and works with it rather than against it, using the awareness of the difficulty as itself a teaching, the koan as a mechanism for making the limit of language experientially available, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Nanan's gesture with the teapot is, in this sense, a koan in physical form. It does not describe the experience of the overfull mind. It demonstrates it. The professor, watching the tea spill, is not reading about the cup. He is the cup. No, the gap between understanding the parable intellectually and inhabiting it as lived experience is exactly the gap the teapot crosses, in its slow and deliberate pour, in the silence that holds the moment before the professor speaks. In the decades after Suzuki's translations, the Nanan parable became one of the most widely known and most frequently cited images in Western encounters with Zen. It found its way into management training and psychotherapy and educational theory, into conversations about creativity and innovation and what was then called lateral thinking. In most of these contexts, the teaching was simplified, the cup as a metaphor for open-mindedness, the pour as a demonstration of what happens when we approach new experiences with fixed ideas. The simplification is not entirely wrong. Open-mindedness is genuinely related to what the parable is describing, but what the simplification loses is the precise and radical nature of the original teaching, that what is being pointed at is not a cultivable attitude, not a disposition that can be added to an already competent set of professional habits, but a fundamental shift in the nature of knowing itself, a shift that cannot be achieved through effort, because effort is exactly what the full cup uses to remain full. The distinction matters, and the tradition is insistent about it. One can practice open-mindedness as a strategy and remain throughout the practice entirely within the territory of the full cup, carefully, deliberately, strategically leaving space for new information, which is not the same thing as genuinely not already knowing. The empty cup is not a cup that has been politely cleared of some of its contents to make room for a new guest. It is a cup that has, through some process not entirely within the control of its owner, become available again to what it actually is, a vessel, empty by nature, filled only incidentally and temporarily, its openness, its fundamental quality, rather than a temporary state to be managed. This is a harder teaching than the simplified version, and it is also, in a certain sense, a more restful one, because if emptiness is the cup's original nature, rather than an achievement, then the work of becoming the empty cup is not additive. It does not require the accumulation of additional practice or the development of further competence. It requires, if anything, a kind of permission to stop filling, permission to set down what has been carried, permission to discover what is left when the carrying is done. The professor who walked away from Nanin's house that evening had been given this permission, though he may not have known how to receive it. He had been shown the image of his own fullness, which is the first and necessary step, and whatever he did with that image afterward was his own, whether he carried it home and set it on a mental shelf and returned to it occasionally, or whether it continued quietly to work in him the way a seed continues to work in soil, requiring nothing further except the ordinary passage of time and the right conditions. What Nanin could not do, and what the parable cannot do for anyone who hears it, is empty the cup on the listener's behalf. The instruction can be given. The image can be set down on the table, spreading slowly in all directions like spilled tea, but the cup in question belongs to the person who brought it to the meeting, and no one else can set it down. Nanin does not seem troubled by this limit. He pours the tea past the brim with the same unhurried care he would bring to a cup that was empty, the same quality of attention, the same two-handed steadiness. He is not trying to embarrass the professor. He is not performing the lesson for the benefit of an imagined audience. He is simply showing what is, the way the cup itself shows what is, that what is already full cannot receive what is offered, that this is not a failure, that it is simply the nature of cups. After the professor has gone, the cup sits on the lacquered table at Nanin's house. The tea has stopped moving. It has settled into the small, still pool it has made around the base of the cup, catching what light comes through the paper screen, cooling slowly in the afternoon air. The cup itself holds what it holds, a small amount of tea, not much, the surface of it perfectly still. The edges of the table are wet where the excess ran. The teapot has been set aside. The room is quiet. There is no urgency in it. The lesson was given, and the student received what he could receive, and walked out into the evening streets. And whatever happened next in his interior life is not something the parable records. What the parable records is this: the wet table, the still cup, the afternoon light. The overflow is not a failure. It is not a mistake. It is an instruction in the form of an accident that was not an accident, a physical demonstration written in cooling tea on a lacquered surface, that what ran over the edge was not wasted, but simply could not be received, that the cup's fullness was not the tea's fault, be quit, and that somewhere beneath the fullness, still and patient and entirely unchanged by everything that had been poured into it, the cup remained what it had always been, empty at its center, open by nature, waiting for nothing but the occasion to be simply what it was. What runs over is what could not be received. This is not a tragedy. It is, in the end, just tea. Along the Silk Road, in the centuries when the route was neither fully mapped nor fully safe, Small caravans moved slowly through the dust of Central Asia, carrying more than they knew. The scrolls were wrapped in cloth against the dry air. The merchants who carried them were not, for the most part, concerned with what was written on them. They were concerned with arrival. But the scrolls traveled west into China all the same, and the ideas inside them, compressed into Pali and Sanskrit, folded into the logic of a world far to the south, began upon arrival to breathe a different air. This is how a philosophy crosses a border, not through proclamation, not through conquest, through the slow accumulation of passage, of dust, of one careful translation at a time, until something new takes root in a soil it was not grown for, and becomes, over generations, unrecognizable as foreign. What arrived in China from India was already old. The Buddha had died several centuries before the teaching reached the Chinese interior. By the time monks and traders carried the first Buddhist texts over the passes of the Pamir Plateau and through the corridors of the Gansu Corridor, the tradition had already branched and argued and refined itself into a vast and intricate architecture of thought. The Abhidharma had catalogued the constituents of experience with painstaking detail. Nagarjuna had written the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, his great work of systematic negation, and the Madhyamaka had become a philosophy of breathtaking precision. There was much to carry. China already had a philosophical life of its own. It had been living for centuries inside the frameworks that Confucius and Lao-tzu and Zhuangzi had built. The Confucian world ordered itself around relationship, duty, the careful cultivation of the self in service of the social whole. The Taoist world was cooler, more ironical, more interested in what happened when effort was released than in what could be achieved through its application. These were not idle preferences. They were ways of understanding what a human life was for and how it ought to be spent, and they were deeply embedded in the texture of Chinese thinking long before the first Buddhist scroll arrived. Something happens when two great philosophical traditions encounter each other across a genuine difference. There is friction, and the friction generates heat, and from the heat, something neither tradition could have produced alone begins to form. What formed, over several centuries of encounter and argument and quiet absorption, was the tradition the Chinese called Chan, and the Japanese, centuries later, would call Zen. It was not Indian Buddhism with Chinese decoration. It was not Taoism wearing Buddhist robes. It was a third thing, genuinely new, carrying the genetic material of both parents without being reducible to either. The Chan that emerged in China had Taoism's suspicion of conceptual elaboration, its instinct that the real thing was always somewhere behind the words, always slipping free of the most careful attempt to pin it down with language. It had Buddhism's rigor, its insistence that the suffering of ordinary human life was not incidental but structural, and that the structure could be examined, understood, and transformed through sustained practice. What it developed on its own was a particular relationship to the sudden and the wordless, a sense that the insight these traditions were pointing toward could not be approached gradually, as one approaches a distant city by covering the ground between, but arrived, if it arrived, all at once, the way a room arrives in light when a shutter is opened. This is a difficult idea to hold. The mind reaches for it with the very faculty the idea suggests is inadequate to the task. But the tradition was not undone by the difficulty. It found over centuries a set of pedagogical instruments precisely designed to work around the mind's habitual tendency to understand by categorizing, comparing, and concluding. Among the most distinctive of these instruments was the koan. A koan, in the Rinzai school that would eventually develop in Japan, is not a riddle with a concealed answer. It is not a puzzle that rewards clever analysis. A puzzle can be solved by someone sitting alone with a sharp enough mind and sufficient patience. A koan defeats that approach by design. The classic formulations: a monk asks Zhaozhou whether a dog has Buddha nature, and Zhaozhou replies with the syllable wu, which means approximately nothing, or not, or absence, are not compressed philosophical theses waiting to be unpacked. They are instruments for doing something specific to the reasoning mind. They are designed to run that mind into a wall and keep it there, working, exhausting itself against the wall's smooth face until the compulsive need to solve, to conclude, to arrive at a formulation that can be reported back to the teacher is finally, temporarily stilled. What the teacher is watching for in those encounters is not the right answer. There is no right answer to bring. What the teacher is watching for is whether the student has genuinely arrived at the place where the answer seeking has been given up, not through discouragement, not through clever simulation of giving up, but through genuine exhaustion of the conceptual faculties claimed to be adequate. The silence that follows that exhaustion is different from all other silences. It is the sound of a cup that has finally been emptied enough to receive something. Bodhidharma, who carries in the tradition the weight of a founding legend, is said to have arrived in China from India in the 5th or 6th century. The stories around him are vivid and not always concerned with historical precision. What the stories carry is something more durable than a date, a philosophical posture, a way of holding the encounter between practitioner and teaching that set the tone for everything that followed. One story places him in an audience with Emperor Wu of Lan, a ruler who had devoted considerable resources to the support of Buddhist institutions, building monasteries, funding the translation of texts, feeding monks. The emperor asked what merit he had accumulated through these acts. Bodhidharma's answer, as the story gives it, was a single syllable of negation. No merit, none at all. The emperor, by any reasonable account, had done exactly what was expected of a pious ruler. He had followed the prescribed forms. He had contributed, materially and substantially, to the propagation of the teaching. The accumulated logic of gradual cultivation, the idea that good acts compound across lifetimes into an ever-improving spiritual position, would have suggested that the emperor had done well, was proceeding correctly, and could expect the results. Bodhidharma's refusal to agree with this was not rudeness. It was the first stroke of a particular kind of philosophical chisel. What the story encodes is a rejection of the transactional model of spiritual life, the model in which practice is a form of investment, in which good acts accumulate interest in an account somewhere, in which the practitioner is gradually closing the distance between the present self and some future, improved self that will one day arrive at the destination. Chan looked at this model and found it not merely insufficient, but precisely backwards. The self that was busily improving itself was the same self that was blocking the view. The accumulation was the obstacle. The merit was the cup already full. The emperor asked where Bodhidharma could be found, and Bodhidharma replied with a question about vast and open emptiness, about whether anything in it could be called holy. The emperor, who had expected a different conversation, did not recognize what he was being offered, and Bodhidharma, by most accounts, left the audience and went elsewhere. The tradition places him next at the Shaolin Monastery, seated before a stone wall. The wall-gazing practice, 9 years. In the stories, though the number carries symbolic weight more than biographical precision, became one of Chan's founding images. Not a teacher addressing a student, not a text being studied, or a ritual being performed, a person and a wall, in silence, for a duration that makes the ordinary categories of progress and achievement simply irrelevant. What could be accomplished facing a wall for 9 years? Nothing that an outside observer could confirm. No credential, no text, no accumulation. Only the long, quiet exhaustion of the expectation that something measurable was supposed to happen, until the expectation itself finally grew still. The patriarchal succession stories, in which the teaching is transmitted from teacher to student across generations, are told not as histories of institutional inheritance, but as accounts of genuine interior transformation, each transmission a moment of direct encounter between minds. Among the most philosophically charged of these stories is the one surrounding the fifth patriarch, Hong Ren, who sought to determine which of his students had genuinely understood the teaching and should receive the transmission. He asked each student to compose a verse demonstrating their understanding. The head monk, Shen Shu, a learned man, respected, accomplished, composed a verse comparing the mind to a bright mirror, and the practice to the daily polishing that kept dust from settling on its surface. The verse was good, it was careful and honest, and described something real about the disciplined work of cultivation. It was also from the standpoint of the Southern Chan school that would emerge from this story not quite the understanding that had been asked for. Huang, who was working in the monastery as a laborer and was not himself literate, heard Shen Shu's verse read aloud and had someone write down a second verse in response. The mind, Hui Neng's verse asserted, is originally empty. There is no mirror stand. If there is no mirror stand, then there is no surface on which dust can settle. Where is the dust to come from? The philosophical distance between these two verses is not merely a matter of preference or emphasis. Shen Shu's verse describes a mind that can be cleaned, which means it can be dirtied, which means it has a surface, a structure, a substantiality that Hui Neng's verse refuses entirely. If the mind is originally and fundamentally empty, not empty as a cup that has been drained, but empty as sky, which has no surface to be clouded, then the relationship between practice and enlightenment changes entirely. There is nothing to polish, there is nothing to fill. There is already, and has always been, open space. This is the doctrine of sudden enlightenment, and the Southern school that carried Hui Neng's inheritance would shape the trajectory of what became Zen in Japan more decisively than any other single formulation. The idea is not that practice is unnecessary. The idea is that practice does not produce enlightenment, the way planting produces harvest. The ground is already what it needs to be. The mirror is already clean. What practice does is reveal what was there before the polishing began, which is to say, what was never actually obscured. Aisai, a Tendai monk who traveled to China in the 12th century, returned to Japan in 1191 carrying the Rinzai school of Chan, the school most associated with koan practice, with the abrupt and testing relationship between teacher and student, with the sudden confrontation that can crack the ordinary mind's composure and allow something else to come through. The tradition he planted took root in the particular soil of medieval Japanese culture, finding an unexpected affinity with the martial classes, whose training already cultivated an intimate relationship with the present moment, whose survival in fact depended on the capacity to act without the delay of deliberation. The tea house, the garden, the formal arrangement of a room, the aesthetic forms that developed around Zen practice in Japan carried the philosophy into the texture of daily life in ways that did not always announce themselves as philosophy. A room that was deliberately spare was not demonstrating poverty. It was demonstrating that space was the active element, that what was absent was what made presence possible. A garden raked into patterns was not merely decoration, it was a teaching about the relationship between form and emptiness, given material expression, available to anyone willing to sit still long enough to let it work. Dogen Zenji, who traveled to China in 1223 and returned carrying the Soto transmission in 1227, had gone looking for an answer to what he considered the most pressing question in Buddhist practice. If sentient beings are already fundamentally endowed with Buddha nature, if the ground is already clean, the mirror already bright, then what was the point of practice? Why sit? Why meditate? Why follow the precepts with such exacting care if the destination is already, in some sense, the point of departure? The answer he found, or the answer he reports finding, did not come through a text or a formal teaching. It came in a monastery kitchen, watching an elderly Chinese cook tend vegetables. The monk, old, meticulous, moving slowly through work that other monks left to novices because it was considered too mundane for sustained attention, was doing something Dogen had not quite seen before. He was not preparing vegetables as a task to be completed before the real practice began. He was not moving through the kitchen with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere, with a text or a teaching or a question. He was entirely there. The vegetables were entirely there. The work and the attention were indistinguishable. What Dogen took from this, and spent the rest of his life articulating in a philosophical vocabulary of extraordinary subtlety, was something close to the following. Practice and enlightenment are not related as means and end. They are not the road and the destination. They are the same event, seen from different angles. To sit in genuine practice is not to work towards some future state of realization. It is to be in that moment fully what one already is, which is to say, fully what has always been here, before the compulsion to improve oneself, to arrive somewhere, to finally be enough, got its hold on the attention. Dogen called this shikantaza, just sitting. The word just does a great deal of work in that phrase. It does not mean merely or only in the sense of something diminished. It means completely, without remainder, without the portion of the self that stands apart and judges how the sitting is going, without the project of becoming something other than what is already present. The sitting is the practice. The practice is the realization. The distinction between them, held at sufficient depth, dissolves. His concept of uchi, often translated as being time, holds that existence and time cannot be separated. Each moment is not a bead on a string, a discrete unit following another unit in a row. Each moment is the whole of existence from within that moment's particular angle. The self that sits is not a fixed thing moving through time. The self is the sitting, which is the moment, which is time itself, which is being. To separate them into components to be analyzed is already to have lost the thread. The philosophical architecture this produces is not easy to describe without doing some violence to it, which Dogen acknowledged openly and spent hundreds of pages demonstrating the inadequacy of language to contain. But the practical instruction that comes from it is not complicated. There is nothing to wait for. There is nothing to accumulate. There is no future self whose arrival will signal that the practice has succeeded. There is this moment, completely, without reservation, and that completeness is not something to be achieved. It is something to stop obscuring. Dogen sailed back to Japan in 1227, carrying the Soto transmission in a form that had not yet had time to settle into its Japanese context. He had been changed by his time in China. The philosophy had crossed a body of water with him, had been subject to the particular quality of attention that comes from a sea journey, the absence of solid ground, the horizon always at the same distance, the sense of being suspended between what was left and what was not yet arrived. He was not returning the same man who had left. The teaching was not arriving the same teaching that had been given. This is what transmission means, in the deepest sense, the tradition intends. A teaching does not travel like a package. It does not arrive intact, identical to what was sent. It changes with its carrier, with the circumstances of the journey, with the soil in which it is planted. The Chinese Tang Dynasty masters who shaped Chan were responding to particular historical pressures, particular philosophical adversaries, particular cultural assumptions about the relationship between scholar and text, between practice and institutional form. Dogen's Japan was not that world, and the Soto school that grew in Japan was not Tang Dynasty Chan. However, clearly, it carried the family resemblance. The Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, one of the texts that gathered the teaching of Huining and his successors, was being read aloud in monasteries across East Asia for centuries before Dogen was born. The monks who sat listening to it were doing something the style guide tends to flatten into the generic. They were arriving at a text from within a specific way of life, with bodies shaped by specific practices, inside institutions whose physical and social architecture was itself an expression of the philosophy. The text was not entering blank minds. It was arriving in minds that had been prepared to receive it by years of the kind of attention the text itself described. To read the Platform Sutra is not to absorb information. It is to enter a particular quality of company. The voice in it is immediate, direct, often colloquial, in ways that cut against the gravity one might expect from a founding document. Huining, if the figure in the text carries anything of the historical person, was not interested in impressing the educated. He was interested in the direct thing, the thing that could not be captured by erudition, that was equally available to the illiterate laborer and the scholar of Sanskrit, that did not require any specific cultural credential to be touched by. This is the radical democratic gesture at the heart of the Southern School's legacy. The original nature is not acquired. It is not improved. It is not more easily accessed by those who have studied longer, or practiced harder, or accumulated more in the way of institutional standing. It is, by its nature, already present in every person who has ever asked a genuine question about the nature of experience. The scholarship matters, the practice matters, but what they are pointing toward was there before the pointing began. The thread from Bodhidharma's wall to Huining's empty mirror, to Dogen's kitchen, to the tea ceremony and the raked garden, and the koan encounter in the Rinzai training hall, runs not as a line of accumulating doctrine, but as a series of returns to the same open question, not the same answer. The answers shifted with each generation, each cultural context, each thinker who brought their particular way of seeing to the encounter. But the question remained, what is already here, before the cup fills up? The Silk Road that carried the first scrolls had long since faded as a commercial route by the time Dogen sailed for China. The caravans were memory, or legend, or the subject of poetry by scholars who had never traveled it themselves. But the movement of ideas did not stop. It never stops. It slows, it changes direction, it passes through intermediaries, it arrives in places it was not expected, and takes forms its originators would not have recognized. This is not corruption. This is not loss of authenticity. It is the only way a living philosophy moves through time. What Dogen brought back across the water was not a package of fixed doctrine. It was a way of meeting experience, directly, without the intermediary of the conceptual self that narrates and evaluates and compares and concludes. The practice he gave to the students who gathered around him was a practice of stopping that narration long enough to find what was underneath it, not emptiness as absence, not emptiness as the blankness of an exhausted mind, emptiness as the condition in which things can be received as they actually are, undistorted by the pressure of what the receiver has already decided about them. The sea between China and Japan was cold in the winter of his return. The water was gray. The distance was sufficient for silence. Whatever Dogen was holding in his mind during those days on the water, whatever the cooking monk's steady attention had given him, whatever the Soto master Rujing had transmitted to him in those months of practice, was undergoing the final stage of transformation that all genuine teaching undergoes before it becomes one's own, not studying, not remembering, just carrying it in the body, across water, toward a country that would need it in a form it had not yet taken. A philosophy that must empty itself to cross a body of water arrives as something it was not before. The crossing is not incidental. The crossing is part of the teaching. What is set down on the other shore still carries the weight of the journey, the cold, the distance, the suspended time between one world and another, and this weight, this particular quality of having been carried across an emptiness, is not erased when the shore is reached. It becomes quietly part of what the teaching now is. In South India, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, a scholar is writing. The light falls at an angle across palm leaves. A stylus moves slowly, pressing marks into the dried surface with a care that suggests the writer knows the argument being assembled here will outlast the material it is being pressed into. The scholar is Nagarjuna. What he is building, mark by careful mark, is not a system of belief, but something closer to its opposite, an argument so thorough in its method of negation that by the time it arrives at its conclusion, every fixed position the reader might have been standing on has been dissolved from beneath them. And yet the reader is not falling. That is the thing. The dissolution, when it comes, feels less like collapse and more like the removal of a weight one had grown so accustomed to carrying that its absence takes a moment to recognize as relief. The work he is writing will come to be known as the Mulamadhyamaka Karika, which might be translated as the root verses on the middle way. It will take centuries to travel north and east. It will pass through languages and monasteries and the careful hands of commentators who will argue over its implications across spans of time that dwarf any single life. But in that moment, in the long quiet of a South Indian afternoon, what Nagarjuna is doing is setting down with great precision the view that nothing has inherent, independent, fixed existence, that all phenomena, every object, and every category, and every conviction arise only in dependence on conditions, and that when the conditions shift, the phenomena shift with them. What looks solid from close enough shows it seems. What appears self-standing, when followed far enough back, dissolves into a network of dependencies with no final ground. This view has a name. Nagarjuna calls it sunyata, which is usually translated as emptiness. The word can mislead. It sounds in English like nihilism, like the view that nothing matters, or nothing exists, or that the world is a hollow and meaningless place. But that is not what Nagarjuna means, and he is careful to say so. The emptiness he is describing is not the absence of things. Things are plainly here, the palm leaf, the stylus, the afternoon light. What is empty is any claim that these things exist on their own, from their own side, independently of the conditions that brought them into being. The cup exists. What the cup does not have is a fixed inherent cupness that belongs to it regardless of who made it, what it is made from, what purpose it serves, and what hands are holding it in this particular moment. Take away the conditions, and the cup is not diminished, but transformed into clay, into elements, into something awaiting its next form. The emptiness is not what the cup lacks. The emptiness is what makes the cup possible. This is the precision of Nagarjuna's argument, and it is considerable precision. He applies the same analysis to causation, to motion, to time, to the self, to perception, following each one down to where it seems to rest on something solid, and finding each time that the solid ground is another dependent arising, another knot in the net, with no final thread to pull. What makes the argument extraordinary is that by the end it turns on itself. Sunyata, the doctrine of emptiness, is itself empty. It does not stand apart from what it describes and look down on it from above. It is made of the same conditions as everything else. Nagarjuna says this plainly, and he means it. The philosophy is not a fixed position. It is a raft, and when the far shore is reached, the raft is left behind. After enough honest application of the argument, what remains is not a doctrine, but a particular quality of open sky, the specific spaciousness that follows from having genuinely released the need for a final ground. Centuries before Nagarjuna was working in South India, a different understanding of emptiness had been taking shape in China. It was older than Buddhism's arrival there. It had grown from within a tradition, more comfortable with paradox than with argument, more interested in what could be pointed at than in what could be formally demonstrated. This understanding belonged to the Tao Te Ching, the text attributed to Lao Tzu, and its image of emptiness is one of the most compact and lasting images in the long history of thought about what is real and what matters. The text offers a wheel. It asks the reader to look at where the usefulness of the wheel actually lives. The spokes radiate outward from the hub, meeting the rim, giving the wheel its shape. But where the hub is solid, the wheel cannot turn on its axle. What makes the wheel a wheel, in the functional sense, what allows it to move, to carry weight, to fulfill its purpose, is the empty space at the center. The spokes would be useless without the emptiness they circle around. The rim would be useless without the hub, and the hub would be useless without the hollow at its core. Remove the emptiness, and you do not have a stronger wheel. You have a heavy object that cannot move. The concept the Tao Te Ching is reaching toward is called Wu, which might be translated as non-being, or as the generative void, or as the nothing from which something continuously emerges. The translation does not quite land in any direction, because the concept itself refuses the clean boundary between being and non-being that makes translation difficult. Wu is not the absence of the Tao. It is one of the modes in which the Tao is active. When the cup is described in the same tradition, the clay forms its walls, but the empty interior is what the cup is for. The point is not that the clay is unimportant. The clay makes the space possible, but the space is not incidental. The space is why anyone makes a cup at all. There is a quality in this image that is difficult to overstate. The wheel, the cup, the room whose walls make possible the space that is inhabited. In every case, the Taoist tradition is doing something philosophically careful, which is to notice that what ordinarily gets treated as background is doing as much work as what gets treated as foreground. The empty center is not the absence of something the wheel needs. It is something the wheel needs. The silence between words is not the absence of the poem. There are traditions, much later and in very different places, that will arrive at exactly this observation from completely different directions. arriving in the same clearing as though the clearing had always been there, waiting, and several separate paths had been converging on it, without any of the walkers being aware of the others. In 14th century Germany, in the Dominican church where a friar named Meister Eckhart is preaching, the congregation is hearing a theology that is making the authorities deeply uncomfortable. Eckhart is not preaching in Latin. He is preaching in the vernacular, in the language people carry home with them, and what he is saying is that the proper relationship between the soul and the divine is not one of accumulation, but of subtraction. The soul, in Eckhart's understanding, does not draw closer to God by acquiring more virtue, more knowledge, more correct belief, more pious acts. The soul draws closer by releasing, by emptying, by learning, through deliberate and sustained practice, to let go of every attachment to created things, including the attachment to its own images of what it is seeking. The word Eckhart uses for this practice is Gelassenheit. It is usually translated as releasement, though some translators reach for letting go, or yielding, or the harder but more precise phrase, sinking into the ground. What Eckhart means by it is the systematic and voluntary surrender of the will's tendency to grasp, to hold on to preferences, images, certainties, even the image of God as a particular kind of being with particular qualities. All of it, Eckhart says, must be relinquished, not because these things are bad, but because they fill the interior space that the divine requires in order to enter. The soul is a cup. A full cup cannot receive. The practice of Gelassenheit is the practice of creating the interior ground, the grunt, Eckhart calls it, the deep ground of the soul, into which what cannot be named can move, unimpeded by the accumulated furniture of a life's worth of preferences and convictions. What makes Eckhart unusual is not just the philosophy, but the audience. He is not speaking to trained theologians who have spent years in formal disputation. He is speaking to women mystics, to lay practitioners, to people who have come to the church in the middle of an ordinary week, carrying the ordinary weight of ordinary lives, and he is giving them a philosophy of radical subtraction in language they can understand and carry. The preaching is not a simplification of the philosophy. The simplicity is the philosophy. Eckhart is describing a practice that is available to anyone willing to undertake the discipline of release, which is to say, a practice that asks not for expertise, but for the willingness to become genuinely less defended, genuinely more open, genuinely more hollow at the center. That same hollow at the center is what Socrates is looking for. He finds it, or makes it, through a very different method, not through devotional surrender, but through conversation that goes somewhere its participants did not expect. In Athens, on a warm morning in the agora, Socrates is following someone. Not physically, the other person is walking, but Socrates is following the shape of their argument, which has just made a claim about justice, or courage, or virtue, and the claim was made with the ease of someone who has never had any reason to doubt that they know what they are talking about. Socrates has heard this ease many times. He finds it more philosophically interesting than any of the claims it accompanies. The method Socrates uses is not a method of instruction. No information changes hands. What changes over the course of a Socratic conversation is the interlocutor's relationship to what they believed they already knew. Socrates asks a question. The interlocutor answers with confidence. Socrates asks what the answer means. A further clarification arrives. Socrates follows the clarification to where it contradicts something the interlocutor said earlier. They repair the contradiction. Socrates follows the repair to another consequence. This continues. At some point, and the point is different each time, and it always arrives. The interlocutor reaches the edge of what they can confidently say, and they find that the edge is much closer than they had understood. The confident expression, so present at the beginning, has given way to something that looks like discomfort. But Socrates does not think of this discomfort as the end of the conversation. He thinks of it as the beginning. The state the interlocutor is now in has a name. Socrates calls it aporia, which means literally a place where there is no path, an impasse, a roadblock, the experience of discovering that a familiar road has run to an edge one did not know was there. In the dialogues where Socrates appears, he does not usually resolve the aporia. The conversation often ends with the interlocutor unsettled and the question open. This has struck some readers as a failure, as though Socrates is asking for what he is not prepared to provide. But in the Apology, where Socrates describes his own understanding of what the examined life involves, he is clear that the aporia is not the failure. The aporia is the gift. The person who enters the agora, certain they know what courage is, and leaves uncertain, has not lost something. They have lost the certainty that was preventing them from asking the genuine question. Their cup has developed, without any fanfare, a small and useful crack. Socratic ignorance, as the tradition has come to call it, is not the same as knowing nothing. Socrates does not claim to know nothing. He claims to know only that he does not know what he doesn't know, and that this awareness, which he arrived at through the experience of discovering how much he had been wrong about, is itself a form of knowing worth defending. The philosopher's task in this understanding is the systematic dissolution of the comfortable misidentification of opinion with knowledge, not to fill the cup with better contents, to empty it of the contents that are not what they claim to be, so that what arrives next arrives into a space that is genuinely clear and genuinely receptive. There is a moment in each of these traditions that is worth dwelling on, not for long, but long enough to feel the shape of what is happening. Nagarjuna, following an argument through layer after layer of assumed solidity until the solidity dissolves into dependent arising. Laozi, pointing at the empty hub of the wheel and asking the reader to locate the usefulness there. Meister Eckhart, urging his congregation in the vernacular to release even their dearest images of what they are seeking. Socrates, barefoot in the heat, following a confident interlocutor down a path that will end at an edge neither of them could see from the beginning. Each of these gestures is distinct in its vocabulary, in its cultural setting, in the problems it was built to address, and yet each of them is pointing at the same functional insight, that the capacity to receive, understanding, presence, the moment as it actually is, requires the prior condition of not being already full. The word Eckhart uses for this practice finds its way centuries later into the vocabulary of a German philosopher working in a farmhouse in the Black Forest. Martin Heidegger is at his desk in the middle of the 20th century. Around him, philosophy has spent decades in the machinery of analysis, of logical rigor, of the systematic clarification of concepts, and Heidegger is finding that the machinery, however precise, cannot reach what he is most interested in. What he is most interested in is the relationship between human beings and being itself, not beings in the plural, the particular objects and entities that populate the world, but being as such, the ground of appearing, the condition under which anything shows up as anything at all. This is a question he has been living with for a long time. He has developed elaborate vocabulary to approach it, and now he finds himself reaching past his own vocabulary for a word from a 14th century Dominican friar. The word is Gelassenheit. Heidegger reclaims it deliberately, knowingly, with full awareness of where it comes from. But he is not appropriating a theology. He is finding in Eckhart's term a description of a mode of thinking he has been approaching from his own direction for decades. He calls it, in his own terms, meditative thinking, contrasting it with calculative thinking, which is the mode of thought concerned with efficiency, with mastery, with the optimal arrangement of means toward predetermined ends. Calculative thinking is powerful. It has built the modern world. But it cannot, Heidegger argues, approach being, because being is not a problem to be solved, or an obstacle to be mastered, or a resource to be optimized. Being requires a different posture, a posture of non-willing, of openness, of release from the compulsion to seize and determine and fix. Gelassenheit, the letting be of things in their own truth, without the imposition of the calculating will. At his desk in the farmhouse, writing the word down and pausing before the next sentence, Heidegger is aware that what he is describing is not easy to arrive at. Calculative thinking is not a bad habit that can simply be replaced. It is the dominant mode of an entire civilization. The capacity for meditative thinking, for the openness that does not grasp, the attention that does not demand, the dwelling that does not exploit, is something that must be deliberately recovered, and recovered against strong currents. The recovery is not a nostalgic return to some earlier and purer state. It is a turn freely chosen toward a mode of relating to the world that has always been available, but that requires something like practice to sustain. The cup must be emptied of the compulsion to fill it, which is a harder task than simply emptying the cup. It is possible to sit with what Nagarjuna discovered, and what the Tao Te Ching pointed at, and what Eckhart practiced, and what Socrates enacted, and what Heidegger was reaching for, and to feel not that they are all saying the same thing in different languages, which would be too smooth, too convenient, but that they are standing at different points around the circumference of something for which no single tradition has the complete view. The differences are real. Nagarjuna is working within a metaphysical framework that Eckhart would not have recognized. Socrates is doing something through conversation that Laozi does through image and paradox. Heidegger is operating within a modern philosophical context that none of them could have imagined. The convergence is not a synthesis. It is more like several lamps in separate rooms, each casting light at a different angle, all of them illuminating the same wall. And what is on the wall, held in that overlapping light, is not an answer. It is a description of a condition, the condition of genuine receptivity, and what the description points at is a specific structural feature of knowing itself. When the cup is already full, not as a metaphor, but as a description of the state of a mind that has already decided, already concluded, already categorized and filed the incoming experience, when that fullness is the prevailing condition, something is lost. What is lost is not merely the possibility of new information, it is the quality of actual contact with what is there. The scholar who sits with Nannen carrying his established views about Zen does not perceive Nannen's teaching at all, not because the teaching is not offered, but because the cup cannot receive it. The teaching runs off the edge of the table. It is not waste, it is instruction, but the instruction can only be received by someone who has noticed the overflow. Nagarjuna finishes a line of argument and pauses, stylus lifted, the long afternoon still around him. He has just applied the method of dependent arising to the method of dependent arising itself. The argument has dissolved its own pretension to final solidity. What remains is not nothing. It is the particular quality of alertness that follows from having genuinely followed an argument where it leads without deciding in advance where it ought to go. The palm leaf sits in the light. The arguments on it are precise. They will travel for centuries, and all of them are pointing with great precision at something that cannot quite be said, something that can only be approached by clearing the approach, making room, releasing the conviction that the territory is already known. A wheel turns in the Taoist image, the empty hub at its center, doing its quiet and essential work. The hub does not announce itself. It does not claim priority over the spokes or the rim. It simply remains what it is, open at the center, stable precisely because it does not insist on filling the space it has been given. The spokes converge on the emptiness, and the emptiness holds them, and between the holding and the converging, the wheel becomes a wheel and begins to move. This is not a metaphor that requires unpacking. It is an image that requires only attention, the kind of attention that does not immediately try to extract the lesson and move on. Let the wheel turn. Let the empty hub be empty. Notice that the motion depends on what is not there. Eckhart's congregation is going home through the streets of a German city in the 14th century. Some of them are carrying what he said, or fragments of it, the way one carries a conversation that has not yet finished. The instruction to release, to empty, to let the interior ground be genuinely clear. This is not a comfortable instruction. It asks for something. It asks for the willingness to sit in a space that has not yet been filled by the next certainty, the next preference, the next image of what is sought. The practice of Gelassenheit is not the achievement of a state. It is the sustained willingness to keep releasing the states that arrive and insist on being permanent. It is a practice of return, not to some original condition, but to the openness that was always there beneath the accumulation, available whenever the accumulation is, for a moment released. Socrates is walking home. The conversation in the agora ended as they often do, with the other person unsettled and the question open, and with Socrates knowing that tomorrow or the week after there will be another conversation, another confident claim, another careful following of the thread, down to where the certainty ends and the genuine inquiry begins. He does not find this tiring. He finds it exactly what a life is for, not the filling of time with well-defended positions, but the patient companionship of questions that do not have an obvious terminus. The farja that aporia is not the end. The aporia is the place where real thinking becomes possible, because the conversation has arrived at the edge of what was merely assumed, and found there the open horizon of what might actually be true. In the farmhouse, Heidegger has set down his pen. The meditative thinking he is reaching for, the Gelassenheit he has reclaimed from the medieval friar, is not something he can demonstrate by writing about it, not entirely, which is part of the difficulty. The thing being described resists its own description, because description is itself a mode of calculative mastery. What he can do is point, and what he is pointing at, from his particular place on the circumference, is the same thing Nagarjuna pointed at from his, and Laozi from his, and Eckhart from his, and Socrates from his. The specific, functional, recoverable condition of genuine openness, the cup that has been emptied not as an end in itself, but as the precondition for whatever might actually arrive. The lamps cast their light from separate rooms across the same wall. One light would show part of it. Two lights would show more, and show it with less shadow, but several lights from several angles, illuminating the same surface, from directions that could not have been planned to coincide. This produces a different kind of seeing, not a brighter version of what was already visible, but a fuller account of the surface's actual texture, its relief and depth, the ways it receives light, and the ways it deflects it. The convergence does not prove that all these traditions are saying the same thing. It suggests that something real is being pointed at, something structural enough to remain visible from this many separate vantage points, something consistent enough to survive translation into this many different vocabularies. When a tradition developed in South India in the 2nd century, and a tradition growing in China across centuries before and after that, and a Dominican friar in 14th century Germany, and a Greek philosopher in the 5th century before the Common Era, and a German philosopher in the 20th century all arrive, by independent routes and in response to very different questions, at an instruction that amounts to the same gesture: release what you are carrying, create the interior space, meet what is here without having already decided what it is. The instruction may not belong to any single tradition's property. It may be pointing at something structural in the nature of knowing itself. The cup metaphor, wherever it appears, is not a cultural artifact. It is a description of a function, knowing, of the kind that actually reaches what it is concerned with, requires a certain quality of prior opening, and prior opening requires the willingness to set down what is already there. The scholar who walked away from Nanin's table carried the image of the overflowing cup with him, perhaps without knowing exactly what he was carrying. The image does not ask for anything immediately, it simply stays. It sits in memory the way a genuine question sits, quietly, without urgency, returning at intervals to offer itself again. The traditions that have been living with this image, or with images that function in the same way, have not resolved the question it raises. They have learned to live with it usefully, to let it do its work, to allow the quality of openness it points at to be, when it can be sustained, the condition under which thinking and attention and presence are most fully themselves. This is not a conclusion. The traditions themselves do not offer conclusions of this kind. What they offer is practice, the sustained, patient, returning practice of making the cup empty enough to receive whatever is being offered in this particular moment, which is the only moment available, and which will not repeat itself, and which is, precisely because it will not repeat, worth meeting without the interference of everything one has already decided it must contain. Several lamps in separate rooms, the same wall receiving light from angles it did not choose. The wall is patient, the light keeps arriving, and in the space between the lamps and the surface they illuminate, in the open interval where light crosses before it touches anything, there is a quality of held stillness that does not belong to any single source, and that all of them in their different ways have been quietly pointing at. At Tasajara, in the late years of the 1960s, mornings arrived slowly. The light came over the ridge in stages, finding the wooden buildings one at a time, and by the time it reached the meditation hall, the air inside was already settled into the particular quality that belongs to places where many people have sat still in the same room for a long time. Shunryu Suzuki stood before the assembled students in that light, unhurried in the way he always was, and said something so plain that several people in the room had to sit with it for years before they understood what had happened to them when they heard it. He said, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. The room received this the way rooms receive things they are not quite ready for. With quiet, it was not a new idea in the tradition he was carrying. The quality he was pointing at, the open, unguarded, expectant quality of a mind that has not yet learned to sort experience into categories of known and unknown before it fully arrives, had been called many things across many centuries. But Suzuki had a way of setting it down in plain language that made it feel less like a teaching being given and more like a recognition already present in the person hearing it, something they had always known but had not quite found words for. The words were beginner's mind, Shoshin, And what he meant by it was not a technique or a skill or even a practice in the ordinary sense. He meant a quality of encounter, a way of meeting experience before the mind has already decided what the experience is. This is worth staying with for a moment because it is easy to hear beginner's mind and understand it as humility, as the practitioner's discipline of remembering they do not know everything, of keeping a modest posture toward their own expertise. That is not quite it. Humility is a correction applied on top of certainty. What Suzuki was describing goes beneath correction, beneath the layer where certainty lives. It is the condition before the mind reaches for certainty at all. It is what remains when the habitual movement toward already knowing is even briefly suspended. The hall at Tasajara would have been still outside, too, the mountain holding its morning quiet. And in that quiet, the instruction was not so much heard as felt, the way some things are felt when the conditions around them are right. A student who had been sitting for years once described the experience of hearing Suzuki speak as arriving at a place they had somehow already been. Not déjà vu, which carries the strange disorientation of the familiar arriving unexpectedly. Something quieter than that. The sense that the instruction was not traveling from the teacher outward, but was meeting something already present in the student, something the student's accumulated knowledge had slowly, carefully, with the best of intentions, buried. This is the central paradox of what Suzuki called beginner's mind. The more a person learns, in the ordinary sense of accumulating knowledge and refining skill, the more difficult the quality of openness becomes to sustain. Not because knowledge is the enemy of wisdom, that would be too simple, and Suzuki was never simple in ways that made things easy, but because knowledge, once gathered, has a natural tendency to organize itself into patterns, and patterns, once established, begin to operate without being asked to. They begin to process experience before experience has fully presented itself. They become, in a word, anticipatory. The expert meets the world already knowing, in some important sense, what is there. This is not a failure of the expert. It is what expertise does, and it does it because it works. The carpenter does not approach the wood the way a child approaches it, with the open, wondering uncertainty of someone who has never held a plane. The carpenter's accumulated knowledge of wood, its grain, its density, its tendency to split or to bend, is precisely what makes the carpenter useful. The knowledge is real, the patterns are real. What they cost, and the cost is real too, is a particular kind of seeing. A researcher named Ellen Langer spent years investigating what happens to the mind when certainty solidifies into habit. She was interested not in incompetence, but in competence, specifically in the way that very high levels of competence could produce a peculiar kind of blindness. What she found, across many studies conducted with students and professionals and practitioners of various kinds, was that the expert's ability to act efficiently within a known domain came at the cost of the ability to perceive that domain freshly. The expert saw not what was there, but what they had learned to expect. When the expected was absent, or when something unexpected was present, the expert was frequently slower to notice than the novice, not because the novice was smarter, but because the novice had not yet learned which things to not look at. She called this conditional thinking, the discipline of holding knowledge lightly, of treating the familiar as though it might not be quite the same as it was yesterday, of asking not what this is, but what this might be today, in these conditions, right now. It is, in philosophical terms, a practice of epistemic humility applied at the perceptual level, before the reasoning mind has had a chance to take over. And what is striking is how close it is to what Suzuki was saying in that wooden hall in the mountains, from entirely within a tradition that had no interest in laboratory methodology and would not have recognized the word epistemic as pointing at anything it needed. Two different roads. It's the same quiet clearing at the end of both. A novice and an expert might stand together, looking at a piece of driftwood, the kind of heavy, twisted piece that washes up on northern beaches, salt-silvered and strange. The novice sees a piece of driftwood. Then, because nothing in the novice's experience has yet told them which possibilities are impossible, the novice begins to see other things too. A handle of some kind, a form with a lean to it, a shape that might or might not be useful for something not yet decided. The possibilities are open because the categories are not yet fully formed. The expert sees the same piece of wood and knows almost immediately, almost involuntarily, what it is and is not good for, what it will and will not do, where its grain runs, and how it will respond to tool and pressure. This knowing is not wrong. It is built from real experience, and it is genuinely valuable. But the wood, under that knowing gaze, has become less itself and more a confirmation of what the expert already carries. Something in the encounter has closed that was open a moment before. Suzuki was not saying the expert should become the novice again. He was pointing at something more delicate, the possibility of carrying accumulated knowledge without being fully captured by it, of knowing, as his tradition put it, while not knowing. The hand that knows the wood, meeting the wood as though for the first time. This is where a thinker from a very different world arrives at the same intersection from a different direction. Jiddu Krishnamurti spoke for decades to large and attentive gatherings on several continents, and what he said, in many different forms across many years, was one insistent thing. He said that the observer and the observed are not separate, that what we call observation, the act of looking at the world, at another person, at a feeling, at a tree, is almost always something closer to recognition than to observation. We see the tree through the accumulated memory of every tree we have ever seen. We see the feeling through the stories we have always told about what that feeling means, and where it comes from, and what it says about who we are. And this layering of memory and interpretation and accumulated self-knowledge over the surface of direct experience is so habitual, so thoroughly the way the mind operates, that most people do not notice it happening. They believe they are seeing the tree. They are, in a more precise sense, seeing their history of trees. Under trees in Ojai, California, he would sometimes stop mid-sentence and ask whether the people listening were actually listening, not as a challenge, not with impatience, but as a genuine question. He seemed sincerely uncertain whether the words he was offering were arriving as words, or whether they were being caught before they landed by the translation mechanism, the part of the mind that converts what it hears into what it already knows, the part that turns the fresh into the familiar so quickly that the freshness never quite has a chance. The question would hang in the warm California air over rows of people who had traveled considerable distances to hear Krishnamurti speak. And in that hanging, something happened that the words themselves had been trying to point at. The people who were already translating would feel the faint discomfort of being caught at it. The people who were genuinely listening would find the listening itself suddenly visible, the way a transparent thing becomes visible the moment you look for it directly. And in both cases, for a brief interval, the usual business of the mind, its incessant categorizing and filing and connecting and already knowing, would slow. That slowing is not nothing. In the Zen tradition, it has a name, Mushin. The word translates roughly and imperfectly as no mind, but the translation does not quite capture what it is pointing at. No mind is not the absence of mental activity. It is not blankness or torpor or the cessation of consciousness. It is something more specific, action and attention moving without the interference of the deliberate self-conscious, commentary-making aspect of the mind, the movement without the moving, as some teachers have described it, effort without the watcher of the effort, seeing without the seer announcing to itself that it is seeing. A Japanese calligrapher raises a brush above a piece of white paper. The paper is waiting, the brush is loaded, and in the moment before the stroke, in the breath-held interval between preparation and execution, everything the calligrapher has ever learned about calligraphy must somehow be present and absent at the same time. Present in the hand, in the arm, in the particular quality of attention that decades of practice have made habitual. Absent in the mind, which must not now interfere with what the body knows. If the mind speaks, if it says, here, now, this stroke, this direction, this pressure, the stroke is already compromised. Not because the mind is wrong about any of it, but because the commentary is slower than the movement, and the movement, to be what it needs to be, cannot wait. This is the paradox that Mushin lives inside. The state cannot be achieved by trying to achieve it, because the trying is the interference. And it cannot be achieved by stopping trying, because the stopping is still a kind of effort. What dissolves it, in the accounts of practitioners who have known it, is not an act of will, but something more like the long, patient loosening of a knot. Through sustained practice, through the thousands of repetitions that teach the body what the mind then has to learn to trust, the compulsive reaching of the deliberate mind relaxes. It does not disappear, it settles, and in its settling, something else, something that was always present beneath the commentary, becomes available. The calligrapher's brush meets the paper. What happens next is not the calligrapher deciding what to do. It is closer to the calligrapher getting out of the way of what the long practice has prepared for. This is one of the more beautiful descriptions in the tradition of what it means to empty the cup, not the dramatic emptying of pouring everything out, not the willful suppression of the commentary, but the gradual, patient practice of loosening the grip of the already known until the cup can hold something other than its own contents. William James, sitting at his desk at Harvard in 1890, writing the chapter that would introduce the phrase stream of consciousness to the English-speaking world, was working towards something related from inside a very different tradition. He was a psychologist, and he was trying to do something psychologists rarely attempt, to describe experience as it actually is before the mind has organized it, before the self has had a chance to divide it into objects and subjects and familiar categories. What he found, looking at the raw flow of awareness before the organizing work begins, was that it does not come in discrete, stable units the way language suggests it does. It does not come as a series of clear, bounded things encountered one at a time. It comes as a continuous flow, ceaselessly novel, perpetually in motion, never quite the same from one instant to the next. The river moves. It does not move from one fixed state to another fixed state. It moves because movement is what it is. James noticed something else too. He noticed that the mind, the ordinary working mind that manages daily life and recognizes faces and decides what to eat, has a deep and irresistible tendency to treat this flowing novelty as though it were stable and fixed, to treat the river as though it were a series of rocks, to see not the actual quality of each moment's experience, but the familiar category the experience is immediately filed under. The person who believes they are seeing a friend is in some strict phenomenological sense seeing the concept of their friend, the accumulated image built from every previous encounter, every known habit and expression and tone of voice, laid over the actual perceptual event the way a transparency is laid over a photograph. The friend is there, the seeing is real, but something of the actual friend, the friend as they are right now, in this light, on this morning, carrying whatever this particular morning has left on them, escapes behind the overlay. James called the tendency to mistake the concept for the percepti the psychologist's fallacy. He meant it as a warning about method, a caution to researchers not to assume that what they observe is already packaged the way their theories suggest it should be, but what he was describing extends well past the methodological. It extends to the ordinary human experience of meeting the world through what is already known about it, of treating the novel as though it were the familiar, because the familiar is what the mind can process efficiently, and what efficiency, once learned, insists on applying. The psychologist's fallacy and the full teacup are at their root the same things seen from different directions. There is a particular comfort in the already known. This is worth naming without judgment. The cup that is full is not uncomfortable to carry. It has weight, and weight is a kind of reassurance. The person who carries a full set of convictions about what they will find in any given encounter, what the world is like, what people mean when they say what they say, what this kind of morning tends to produce, moves through the day with a certain fluency. The categories do their work without being asked. The familiar is identified quickly, the patterns hold, and there is something restful in this, something that functions in the ordinary sense extremely well. What it does not do, what the full cup cannot do, is receive. Shunryu Suzuki was not saying the full cup is wrong to be full. He was saying that fullness and receptivity are in tension, and that the practice he was offering was a practice of loosening that tension, not by emptying the cup in some violent or final way, but by learning to hold it more lightly, by developing what his tradition called beginner's mind, not the actual ignorance of the beginner, which is simply the absence of knowledge, but something more deliberate and more difficult, the practiced openness of someone who knows but does not let the knowing close the door. This is a subtlety the teaching can lose if it is held too tightly. Beginner's mind is not a performance of not knowing. A person who has spent decades studying something and then performs ignorance about it has not achieved beginner's mind. They have achieved a new kind of closure, a closure around the performance of openness. What Suzuki was pointing at is not the absence of expertise, but the absence of the need to be the expert. The brush knows what it knows. The hand knows what it knows. The mind, for the length of a stroke, can afford to rest. Krishnamurti arrived at something structurally similar through a different path, one less concerned with tradition and practice, and more concerned with the moment-to-moment mechanics of attention. He was suspicious of systems, including the systems of organized Zen, because he believed that systems, however carefully designed, tend to produce the same closure in the student that experience produces in the expert. The student of a system learns to see through the system's categories, which is a form of seeing, but which tends to replace the original conditioning with a different and no less binding form of it. What he proposed instead, though he would have resisted the word proposed, with its suggestion of a method, was the possibility of attention without the attender, observation without the observer, the act of looking that does not first pass through the accumulated self, looking at itself looking. This is very close to Mushin. It is very close to what James was describing when he tried to get at experience before the organizing work begins. and it is very close to what the beginner encounters before expertise has had a chance to install its necessary and costly filters. In Ojai, under the large old trees, someone would raise a hand and ask how this was to be done. How does one observe without the observer? And Krishnamurti would pause in the particular way he had, and then say something that was not exactly an answer, but was not exactly not an answer either. He might say, "Can you look at that tree?" And he would gesture toward one of the actual trees surrounding the gathering, without the word, without the concept, without the accumulated image of what trees are and have been. And then he would wait. And in the waiting, a room full of people who had come to hear an answer would find themselves, briefly, doing the thing itself, looking at an actual tree in the afternoon light, without quite knowing what to make of it. For the length of that not knowing, the cup was empty. What these three, Suzuki, Krishnamurti, and James, were reaching toward from their separate approaches is something that can be described, but not quite delivered by description. The act of description, precise and careful as it can be, is itself a filling of the cup. It is the already knowing turned toward the not yet known, which is exactly the movement the teaching asks to be, at least occasionally, released. This is one of the persistent difficulties that surround beginner's mind as a concept. The more clearly it is understood, in the intellectual sense, the further the understanding is from what it is pointing at. One can know everything there is to know about Shoshin and still meet every experience through the thick glass of the already known. One can hold the entire teaching of Mushin in the mind as a beautiful and well-organized understanding and still be nowhere near it. This is not a contradiction in the teaching. It is the teaching. The pointing finger and the moon it points at are not the same thing, and the practice of following the finger, valuable as it is, can easily become the practice of studying the finger. The student who has spent years learning the doctrine of beginner's mind has spent years filling their cup with the doctrine of emptying the cup. This is not failure. It may be, in fact, exactly what is supposed to happen, the cup filling in a new direction, so that the next emptying is more informed, more deliberate, more genuinely a release rather than a performance of release. Suzuki sat with this paradox and did not try to resolve it. His teaching had a quality of patience that is itself instructive. He did not seem to believe that beginner's mind was a destination that once reached could be held. He seemed to believe it was more like a direction, something that could be moved toward, again and again, each morning, each sitting, each encounter, without the expectation of arrival. The expert who holds their expertise lightly is not a permanent condition. It is a practice. The cup is not emptied once and then kept empty. It is returned to its emptiness gently and repeatedly in the way a breath is returned to the breathing. In the morning light at Tasajara, after the talk, the students would have dispersed to their assigned work or to their sitting, and the hall would have been left to itself for a while. The wooden walls, the light coming through the high windows, the particular quality of air in a room where many people have breathed quietly together. And if someone had sat in that emptied hall for a few minutes after the others had gone, they might have noticed something that is difficult to name. Not silence exactly, because silence suggests the absence of something that was there before, something more like openness. The quality of a room that has been attended to, that has held something carefully, and is now holding nothing in particular with the same care. This is what the full cup cannot do. It can hold its contents. It can carry them from one place to another. It can display them and share them and build on them and refine them. But the quality of holding nothing, the patient, open, spacious quality of genuine receptivity that belongs to the cup that has, at least for a moment, set down what it knows. Ellen Langer's research produced its results in laboratories with specific methodologies and measurable outcomes, and that world is a long way from a wooden meditation hall in the California mountains. But the observation at the center of both is the same observation. When the mind is confident about what it is looking at, it stops looking as fully. When it has already sorted the incoming into known categories, it processes what it expects rather than what is actually arriving. The expert's gain is real, and the expert's loss is real, and both are the same transaction. The transaction by which knowledge is purchased at the cost of freshness, by which fluency is purchased at the cost of encounter. The novice who does not yet know which things are impossible is not in possession of a superior intelligence. The novice is simply still in the country of open possibility, which is a country everyone passes through, and which expertise, by its very nature, requires leaving. Beginner's mind is not the wish to return to that country. It is something harder and more valuable, the practice of carrying forward into the country of knowledge and competence and accumulated skill, the quality that the first country had in such effortless abundance. Open, patient, willing to be wrong about what is there, willing to not yet know. James, watching the stream of consciousness in the late 19th century and trying to catch it before it organized itself, was doing something that required a particular quality of attention. He had to look at experience without the apparatus of his own extensive psychological knowledge, solidifying into a screen between himself and the raw perceptual event. He had to be, in the very moment of looking, both the psychologist who knew how to look and the beginner who had not yet learned to see what the psychology expected. This is not easy. It may be, in fact, one of the more demanding disciplines available to a mind trained to organize and explain, to use the training to see past the training, to fill the cup with a knowledge of emptying, and then, carefully, to empty even that. The stream flows. It does not arrive in units. It does not hold still to be categorized. The novice who sits beside it and watches, not knowing what rivers are supposed to do, receives it as it is. The expert who sits beside it with a full apparatus of hydrological knowledge receives it as a confirmation of what is already known. And what James was suggesting very carefully, from within his own expertise, was that the actual river, the river as it is, flowing, novel, never quite the same, is more interesting than any theory of rivers, and that the habit of preferring the theory is so deeply embedded that most people never notice they have made the substitution. The morning at Tasajara ended the way mornings at practice centers tend to end, not with a conclusion, not with anything settling into place, but with the quiet continuation of the day. Students going to their work, the sound of the kitchen beginning to prepare the midday meal, the light moving across the ridge. Suzuki's words already becoming the thing words become when they are genuinely received, not an item of knowledge, but a quality of attention, diffuse and unhurried, folded into the texture of the morning. Beginner's mind does not announce itself. When it is present, it is simply the quality of being fully in the encounter, the morning as the morning, the word as the word, the tree as the tree, the cup as the cup. The expert's knowledge is not absent, but the expert's need to already be knowing is for a moment quiet, and in that quiet, the world is permitted to be precisely as it is, without amendment, without interpretation, without the translation that turns experience into confirmation of what was already held. A practitioner sitting in ordinary morning light, teacup in hand, the familiar room around them, does not need to have heard of Shoshin or Mushin or the stream of consciousness or conditional thinking to encounter the moment freshly. The tea is warm. The light is the light this morning makes, not the light of yesterday's morning, which is gone. The cup is full as it is, and will be empty as it will be, and in the space between knowing this and needing to do anything about it, something rests. Beginner's mind is not something to be achieved by wanting it. It is not a reward for sustained practice, though practice opens toward it. It is not the property of the beginner, though the beginner has it by default. It is what remains when the cup has been held lightly enough, long enough, that the holding itself becomes a kind of release. The cup does not need to be filled differently. It does not need to be improved. It only needs, now and then, to be set down long enough that the emptiness inside it, the emptiness that was always there, underneath whatever it was carrying, has space to simply be what it is. At Maverick Concert Hall in Woodstock, New York, on an August evening in 1952, a performer walked to the piano, adjusted the bench, and sat down. The hall was open to the summer air on three sides, the way that particular building had always been, wood and light, and the surrounding forest pressing in at the edges. The audience settled. The performer opened the score, placed it on the stand, and raised his hands above the keys. He did not play. The score had 3 movements, each marked with a single instruction: tacit, be silent. The performer closed the keyboard cover at the start of the first movement and sat. He opened it again, briefly, then closed it for the second. The third movement passed the same way, hands resting, keys untouched, the body of the instrument silent inside its cabinet of polished wood. The pianist watched a stopwatch. The audience, uncertain at first, began to listen to what was already there. Wind moved through the trees outside the open walls. Somewhere in the middle distance, rain had begun, and the sound of it arrived in the hall softly, without announcement. The audience heard their own breathing. They heard the particular quality of a room full of people who have stopped fidgeting, the collective stillness of those who have been given permission to hear what was already playing before anyone arrived. 4 minutes and 33 seconds passed. The performer stood, bowed, and left the stage. What John Cage had composed was not silence. What he had composed was a frame, a duration of structured attention, within which everything that had been present all along was suddenly, undeniably, music. The work had a score, a performer, a runtime. What it did not have was any sound the composer had chosen to introduce. And in that absence, in that emptied interior, the hall became the instrument. The audience became the hall. The wind and the rain and the nervous shifting of people sitting in the unexpected became the event they had come to hear. Cage had been studying Zen with D.T. Suzuki at Columbia University in the years before he composed the piece, and something of what Suzuki taught had worked its way into the structure of his thinking, not as doctrine, not as program notes, but as a permission, the permission to discover that what had been dismissed as background was not background at all. It had only been waiting for the composed sound to fall away so that it could be recognized for what it was. The cup, once emptied of what had been deliberately placed inside it, was found to be already full of something else entirely, something that had always been there, attending its own quiet music. The Japanese word for this kind of emptiness is not, as it might seem from a distance, a word for absence. The concept of ma, which lives in architecture and in music and in the swept gravel of a Zen garden, does not describe what is missing. It describes what is structurally present in the form of space. A doorway, in the understanding of ma, is not a gap in a wall. It is an entity in its own right, defined by the careful placement of what surrounds it. doing specific and necessary work that no solid material could do. The pause between two musical notes is not an interruption of the music, it is part of the music's body. The silence between two words in a careful conversation carries meaning the words alone cannot hold. This is not a difficult idea to arrive at intellectually. The difficulty is in actually experiencing it, in allowing the space to be the thing, rather than merely the place where the thing will eventually appear. Mere requires that the observer consent to wait, and not a waiting of suspension, but a waiting of reception, a quality of openness that is active and patient and entirely different from simply doing nothing. The empty space at the hub of a wheel is not passive. Without it, the wheel does not turn. Ryoanji, a temple in the northwest part of Kyoto, there is a garden that has been maintained in essentially the same form since the late 15th century. 15 stones, arranged in 5 groups, set within a rectangular bed of raked white gravel. The stones are not identical. They are not arranged symmetrically. No single standing position in the garden allows a viewer to see all 15 at once. There is always one hidden, always something remaining just out of view. The raked gravel extends from stone to stone, and around them, pale and carefully tended, the lines drawn in it each morning by monks with wooden rakes. Most visitors arriving for the first time find the garden in the hour when the temple is open and other visitors are present. But in the early morning, before the gates open to the day, there is a particular quality to the light across the gravel that visitors rarely see. The stones stand in their positions, unhurried, and the gravel holds the low horizontal light in its parallel lines, and the empty expanse between the stones is neither waiting nor vacant. It is doing its full work. The negative space of Ryoanji is not the absence of something more interesting. It is the medium through which the stones become what they are, distinct, weighted, present to one another across the distances between them. If the gravel were filled, if the spaces were occupied, the stones would vanish into decoration. What makes each stone itself is precisely the openness that holds it. Pascal spent the winter of 1654 writing in a room in Paris, and what he wrote, in fragments that were never assembled into a finished book, included an observation about silence that has not aged. The capacity to remain quietly in a room. He was writing about specifically that, about the difficulty of sitting still without distraction, without entertainment, without the manufactured urgency of an occupied life, was, he concluded, something most people found nearly impossible, not because they were weak or lacking in discipline, but because the silence, when genuinely encountered, becomes the place where everything the ordinary noise had been covering begins to surface. The candle burned beside him. The room around him was a demonstration of what he was writing. He was alone. He was sitting still, and the quiet that surrounded him was the same quiet he was describing. Not comfortable quiet, not the peaceful absence of disturbance. The silence that arrives when distraction has been genuinely set aside is a particular kind of presence, and what it brings with it is not always welcome to a mind accustomed to the protection of noise. Pascal knew this from the inside. He was not diagnosing a weakness he had observed in others. He was writing from somewhere much closer, and what he noticed, writing in that cold room, was that the compulsive filling of silence with entertainment, with work, with the maintenance of a busy and outward-facing life, was not a minor personal failing. It was the shape of a kind of suffering, not the suffering of those who sit with silence, but the suffering produced by the refusal to. The noise, taken in aggregate, was not distraction from pain. It was the pain, accumulated and running beneath the surface of every hour, that was too occupied to notice it. The cup that will not empty cannot receive, and the cup that cannot receive is simply filling itself again and again with the same contents. There is a tradition in apophatic theology, the theology of the via negativa, the path that approaches what is ultimate by way of subtraction rather than description, that takes Pascal's observation and follows it much further into the architecture of a life. The author of a medieval text called The Cloud of Unknowing, writing anonymously in 14th century England, described a specific kind of contemplative practice in which the practitioner does not approach God through accumulated knowledge of divine attributes, through the names and descriptions theology has assembled over centuries, but through the systematic and deliberate relinquishment of all of them. One by one, the concepts are set aside, the images are released, the descriptions fall away. What remains when they have all been let go is not a void. It is what the tradition calls a cloud of unknowing, a dense, dark, undifferentiated presence that cannot be grasped by thought, but can be touched by love. The anonymous author was not the first to walk this path. Pseudo-Dionysius, writing centuries earlier in Greek, had described the divine as beyond being and beyond knowing, not in the sense of being distant or absent, but in the sense of being so fully present that no concept was large enough to contain it. And Meister Eckhart, preaching in the German vernacular to congregations that included women and lay practitioners who had no access to the Latin of the scholars, translated this same understanding into the language of ordinary experience. He called the interior space that opens when all acquired images have been released the grunt, the ground, the foundation, and he described it as the place where something more foundational than individual consciousness could move and act and be known in a mode beyond knowing. These are not easy ideas to follow at full speed, but at the pace of a quiet room, they have a different quality. The essential motion they describe is always the same, the deliberate release of the already held, the emptying of the cup, the creation of interior space, not through forced stillness, but through the patient letting go of what was filling it. It is not emptiness arrived at by deprivation. It is emptiness recognized as the condition that was always present beneath the accumulated weight of what had been placed there. The default mode network is a set of brain regions that become active during rest and self-referential thought. The neuroscientist Marcus Reichel first described it clearly in the early 2000s, and what the research has continued to show in the years since is that the network generates the particular kind of mental activity that most closely resembles what Pascal was writing about in that candlelit room, the ongoing narration of a self, the rehearsal of past conversations, the projection of anxious futures, the steady maintenance of the story a person tells about who they are and what they need and what they have not yet finished. It runs continuously below conscious threshold, and it is metabolically expensive. The resting brain is not resting at all. The contemplative practices that Zen and related traditions have developed over centuries, seated meditation, walking meditation, the sustained attention to breath, the practice of meeting each arising thought without attachment and without rejection, produce, when practiced with any consistency, measurable shifts in the activity of this network. The narration softens, the habitual running commentary of the self-referential mind loses some of its compulsive momentum, not permanently, not irreversibly, but in the way that a fire that is not constantly fed begins, slowly, to burn at a lower pitch. What the practice opens is not an absence of consciousness. It is a different register of consciousness, quieter, less driven by the maintenance of a continuous personal narrative, more available to what is simply present in the moment that is actually occurring. Pascal and the Zen monks and the anonymous English author of the cloud text were not describing the same thing from within the same conceptual framework, but they were describing something that shares a structural resemblance, the particular quality of attention available to a mind that has consented to stop generating its own noise long enough to hear what was already there. This is what the empty cup is for. A practitioner in the final approach to sleep inhabits a specific kind of liminality, the threshold condition between waking and the open territory beyond it. The body has already begun its settling. The temperature of the room has been admitted, the weight of the bedding acknowledged, the particular darkness of the space accepted without resistance. But the mind, accustomed to its work, does not always follow immediately. It continues its accounting, its revisiting, its gentle insistence on one more thought before release. The default mode network is especially active in this threshold space, and the narration it generates can be entirely banal. The list of tomorrow's obligations, the fragment of a conversation that did not end cleanly, the question of whether the door was locked and yet remained sufficient to hold the body in a kind of sustained readiness, the muscles not quite given permission to fully loosen, the breath not quite settled into its own unhurried rhythm. What the contemplative traditions found, through what amounts to millennia of accumulated investigation, is that the ordinary effort to stop this narration, to force the mind to be quiet by opposing its movement, tends not to work. The attempt to suppress produces the opposite of what is wanted, the way that trying to make still water flat by pressing on it only creates more disturbance. What works, to the extent that anything works, is closer to what the practitioners describe as non-doing, or wu-wei, the Taoist concept of action that does not interfere with what is naturally occurring. The mind is not forced into silence, it is simply not followed. Each thought is noticed, briefly and without judgment, and released, not pushed away, not held, simply allowed to arrive and to continue moving, the way clouds move through sky, without the sky making any effort to hold them or to send them on. Slowly, when practiced with enough patience, this produces a kind of settling that forcing never could. The wind that came through the open walls at Maverick Concert Hall on that August evening in 1952 was not asked to be musical. The rain that had begun in the trees at the edge of the clearing was not composed or arranged. The sound of people breathing and adjusting and gradually becoming still as the performance continued without a note being played. None of this had been written into the score, and yet what the audience who were present consistently reported was the experience of hearing, for the first time, or in a way that had the quality of the first time, the world that had always been sounding just beneath the threshold of their ordinary attention. The hall, emptied of what they had come to receive, had become a vessel for what had always been there. Cage understood that the empty cup could not be planned. It could only be made possible. The score for 433 inches did not generate silence. It suspended the introduction of deliberate sound long enough for the silence that was already present to become audible. The performer was not the source of what was heard. The performer was the one who had consented to stop being the source, and in that consent, everything else became what it was. There is a moment in the approach to sleep that carries this same quality, though it cannot be forced into arriving. The moment when the last thread of deliberate thought releases its tension, when the accounting and the rehearsing and the cataloging of the day's remaining business finally loosens its grip, not because it has been defeated, not because anything has been resolved, but simply because the accumulated weight of the body's desire for rest has grown heavier than the mind's desire to continue. The thought that was forming does not complete itself. The sentence trails into something that is no longer a sentence. The boundary between the last awareness and the first darkness becomes, in retrospect, impossible to locate. This is not an achievement. It is not a state that more discipline would produce more reliably. It is what happens when the conditions for it have been allowed to accumulate, when the body has been given warmth and stillness, when the mind has been given something slow and unhurried and gentle to rest against, while its own urgency gradually dissipates. The cup empties not by force, but by a kind of consent that is less an act than an absence of resistance. Mao, the Japanese concept of generative interval, describes not only the space between stones and the pause between musical notes, but also the quality of an ending. When a piece of traditional Japanese music concludes, the sound does not simply stop. It tapers into the surrounding silence in a way that allows the silence to receive it, the final note releasing into the air and continuing to vibrate inaudibly until it has become indistinguishable from the stillness that surrounds it. The ending is not a wall, it is a gradual merging, a returning of the sound to the medium through which it traveled. The way that a stone dropped into still water eventually allows the rings to widen and fade until the surface is again what it was. The anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing wrote that the practitioner should not try to press through the cloud by the force of their understanding. The cloud was not an obstacle to be overcome, it was the condition of approach. To push against it was to misunderstand what kind of territory was being entered, territory that received those who came to it empty-handed and turned back those who arrived carrying their full complement of concepts and conclusions and prior certainties. The instruction was not to become empty. The instruction was to notice that underneath all the things that had been accumulated, emptiness had always been the ground. This is what Nanin's tea was about. Not the scholars failing, not the overflow as lesson delivered from above, but the simple physical demonstration that a cup already full cannot receive what is offered to it. The tea did not judge the scholar's fullness. It simply ran over the edge and spread across the lacquered table, doing what tea does when there is nowhere else for it to go, and the table held it, patient and indifferent, in the way that surfaces hold what spills onto them, without comment, without correction, simply receiving what arrived. In the long tradition that runs from the Silk Road through Huing's verse and Aisai's return from China and Dogen's kitchen garden and the sand circles raked each morning at Ryoanji and D.T. Suzuki's manuscripts traveling westward across an ocean and Shunryu Suzuki's simple instructions in a wooden hall in the California mountains. In all of it, the instruction has remained essentially constant and essentially simple, not because simplicity was chosen as an aesthetic preference, but because the thing being pointed at was already present and had never required anything more complicated than the removal of what was obscuring it. What is pointed at is not a state to be achieved. It is not the product of a completed practice. It is not the reward at the end of sufficient effort. It is the ground that effort has always been taking place on, the medium through which all the reaching and seeking and accumulating has always moved, and which has never moved itself, never changed its nature, never required anything from those moving through it. Empty, open, present, still. The practitioner in the last moments before sleep is not trying to arrive somewhere. The body is already there. The warmth has already gathered. The particular darkness of the room has already been accepted, and the quality of the air, and the sound of the building settling, if it settles, or the particular silence of the neighborhood at this hour, if it is silent, the conditions for rest are already in place. What remains is only the releasing of the held, not the forcing down of what wants to rise, not the imposition of quiet over the natural movement of a mind that is finishing its day, simply the gradual withdrawal of attention from the stream of content, each thought noticed, each thought allowed to pass, nothing pursued, nothing suppressed, the stream continuing to move, but the hand no longer reaching into it to take hold of what it carries. The water flows. The watching becomes less effortful. The space between thoughts extends, imperceptibly at first, then in longer intervals, then with a quality that is difficult to observe, because the observer is doing less and less observing. Cage's audience at Woodstock found, somewhere in the middle of those 4 minutes and 33 seconds, that they had stopped waiting for the music to start. The waiting had dissolved quietly, and in its place was only the sound of what had always been happening. Wind and rain and breath and the specific acoustic character of a wooden hall in August, received, now, without the layer of anticipation that had been filtering it. They were not enlightened, they were not transformed, they were simply present, for a moment, in a room they had been physically inside all along, but had not, until the waiting dissolved, actually inhabited. This is the cup that empties, not dramatically, not once, with permanence and great significance, but in small and ordinary moments, the moment before sleep, the moment between thoughts, the pause in a conversation that is long enough to feel spacious, rather than merely absent, the early morning cup of tea, in a room where nothing is yet demanding attention, and the light is coming in at a low angle that makes the ordinary surfaces of the room briefly unfamiliar and beautiful. The raked gravel at Ryoanji is not trying to be empty. The surface is maintained each morning, not in order to create a spiritual state, but in the way that any careful attention to a specific practice maintains the conditions within which something can occur that could not occur without it. The monks who rake the gravel are not achieving emptiness. They are performing the repeated action that keeps the medium clear, the cup washed, the interior available, the surface level and undisturbed and ready to receive the morning light in whatever form it chooses to arrive. Dogen, returning to Japan by sea in 1227, carrying the Soto transmission and the memory of an elderly cook tending vegetables, with a care that had dissolved the distinction between formal practice and ordinary work, understood that the transmission he was carrying was not a thing he possessed. It had passed through him. It would continue. The sea between China and Japan was not an interruption in the lineage's journey. It was part of the journey, the necessary crossing, the emptying out that travel always performs on the traveler, the stripping away of familiar context that makes arrival possible. What crosses water arrives changed. What empties itself in order to cross a boundary becomes, in the crossing, something it was not before. The cup that is carried to the table, having been washed, is not the same cup as the cup still sitting full of yesterday's tea. Not in kind, but in readiness. The philosopher who left Nanan's table that evening walked home through streets that felt, without his being entirely sure why, slightly different than they had on the walk there. The sound of his own footsteps on the pavement, the lamplight falling at the familiar angle across the familiar facades. He had not been taught something. He had not been corrected. He had been shown in the most direct possible way, the only way that a teaching of this kind can be conveyed, which is not by description, but by demonstration, that what he had brought with him to the table had prevented him from receiving what was offered. He had not been shamed. Nanan had not been unkind. The tea had simply gone where there was room for it to go, which was over the edge, across the lacquered wood, cooling in a spreading pool at the scholar's side. The cup had simply been itself, doing what cups do. And in doing what cups do, it had described with perfect precision the condition of the man sitting before it, full, polished, carefully maintained, and with no room in it for anything more. The crack that the scholar carried home with him that evening was small. It might have healed. It might have widened. The tradition does not say, because the tradition is not interested in what the scholar eventually concluded. The tradition is interested in the cup, in what the cup showed, in the way a cup, emptied and washed and set on a table, holds a quality of openness that is not neutral, but active, the readiness to receive, the spacious interior that is not absence, but the condition of all reception. Pascal's candle burned down in the room in Paris. The rain at Woodstock found the wooden hall open to it. The stones at Rayonji continued to stand in their gravel, indifferent to visitors, receiving the light as it came, casting shadows as the sun moved, asking nothing of the space around them except that it remain clear. The long tradition of the empty cup, which is also the tradition of the open gate, and the cleared ground, and the released breath, and the silence after the final note, does not end at any particular point, because it was never moving toward one. The cup does not fill itself as a culmination. The cup empties, and in its emptying becomes what it always was before it was filled, ready, open, held in the world as a small vessel, patient in its stillness, not waiting for anything in particular, not resisting what arrives. The air inside an empty ceramic cup in the early morning, in a room where the tea has been finished and set aside, carries the temperature of the room and the particular quality of the silence and the angle of the light as it moves across the wooden surface toward the cup's edge, and then, slowly, into the cup itself, illuminating the interior that has no color of its own, but takes on very softly the color of whatever the morning decides to give it. The cup is still, not empty in the way that something emptied is diminished. Empty in the way that a doorway is empty, the fullness of an opening, the presence of space prepared for whatever will enter it, whenever it enters, from whatever direction. Outside, the night continues its slow work of becoming morning. The darkness is not urgent. The light is not arriving yet. Between the two, in the particular interval that has no name because it does not persist long enough to require one, everything rests. The stones in their gravel, the performer's hands above the silent keys.